At 11:17 on a Friday night in December, I watched a live video on my phone of my husband in my father's Santa suit dancing in the middle of a stranger's living room, while a woman in a red dress fed him a cookie and called him her favorite holiday secret. And I stood very still in my own kitchen with my hand on the back of a chair and felt my face heat like I was the one under the lights. And I thought about how he had left our house an hour earlier, saying he was headed to the children's wing at St. Ruby's to read stories and hand out stuffed bears, and how I had helped him fasten the belt and settle the hat and smooth the white beard because that suit is a piece of my family and I treat it like it is a person. And I had said, "Tell the nurses I will bring hot chocolate in the morning." And he had kissed my cheek and said ho 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 like a joke. And then I watched him in someone else's house in that same suit, swaying to a pop song while people clapped, and a blonde woman in a green velvet headband turned her camera to show off her tree and typed "Love when Santa comes early." And it was like a sleeve ripped off my life, loud and fast, and for one long breath I had to sit because my legs forgot what to do. My name is Hannah. I am 36. And I run programs at the Cedar Ridge Library, which means I spend my days making calendars, stapling flyers, sitting cross-legged on rugs to read to toddlers, calling vendors about folding chairs, and knowing which plugs on the east wall trip if the coffee urn and the projector get greedy at the same time. And I like that I am the kind of person who can fix things without needing to be seen fixing them. And I like that I can read a room as easily as a page. And I like small work that matters. And I like to leave a place better than I found it. And I like lists, not because they control people, but because they calm storms. My father was a firefighter who loved cookies and clean boots and small jokes. He used to say that smoke has a sound, and you learn it with your bones. And every December he would take 2 nights off, put on a red suit my mother sewed, and go to the hospital to visit kids who could not go home. And he would sit by their beds and hold hands and say their names like they were heavy gifts and he was strong enough to carry them. And after he died, I kept his suit in a cedar box with a note on top that says "Wash by hand, no bleaches." And when I took it out the first time without him, my hands shook and then steadied. And every year since, I have brought it to St. Ruby's, and I have worn it once or twice myself when the main volunteer got sick. And I never once put it on for a party in a stranger's house under a blinking plastic reindeer with a bartender shaking drinks in the kitchen like snow. My husband is named Evan. He is 38. He sells houses, and he talks like the room is a porch, and he is the only person with a rocking chair. People like him because he looks at you when you speak and repeats your words back to you like he found them. He knows how to make a small thing sound big and a big bill sound small. He moves through our town in a way that makes him look like the mayor. He waves and claps backs and takes calls while he walks. He is good at his job, and for a long time he was good at being married to me. Or at least it looked like he was, and I chose to believe what it looked like. We live in a small blue house with a steep roof and a brick chimney and a list of mild repairs on the fridge. We have a dog named Juniper who tries to herd the mail, and we have a tradition in our neighborhood called chimney pockets, which is a line of red felt pockets in the shape of tiny chimneys that hang on doorknobs. The PTA sells them every December to raise money for classroom books. And neighbors tuck candy or notes in them for kids during the week before winter break. And on the last Saturday before Christmas, everyone does a candle walk and checks their pockets and says thank you to whoever put in the peppermint sticks. And I love it because it is simple and kind, and because you never outgrow the feeling of finding a surprise where you hang your keys. I saw the live video of Santa dancing because Lena, who used to babysit my niece, posted it to her story and tagged the host. And the host was Sienna Bright, which is not her real last name, but she uses it on all her accounts, and it matches the way she enters a room. She runs a small nonprofit called Bright Wishes that collects toys and coats and runs a gala each winter. She is good with donors and with photos and with being seen. She laughs with her head back and grabs a forearm when she tells a joke. She started working with Evan 3 months ago to stage and photograph homes for his winter listings. And I met her twice. Once in our kitchen when she needed the light by the sink for a flat lay of cookies, and once in her office when I dropped off old picture books from the library to be wrapped for the toy drive. and she has a way of asking for favors that makes you feel like she is doing you one, and my whole body is allergic to that trick. When Evan told me he wanted to borrow the Santa suit that night, he said Sienna had asked if he could help at the hospital because their usual volunteer had the flu, and I hesitated because lending that suit is like lending my father's voice. And then I said yes because the point of the suit is to be used for good things, not kept like a museum. And I told him the beard hooks are delicate and not to get hot cider on the cuffs. And he smiled and said yes ma'am and did a little bow, and I let my guard down because he looked like the boy who brought me flowers on a Wednesday for no reason. He left at 10:12 with a sack slung over his shoulder, and I wiped the counter and loaded the dishwasher and picked up Juniper's tennis ball and was about to get into bed when my phone buzzed, and I saw the small circle with Lena's face and the words "was on fire" and clicked like a reflex. And there he was, my Santa, in Sienna's living room, not the hospital, in a room I recognized because I had been there to drop off books, a high ceiling with a beam that does not carry weight, a wall of windows you cannot open, a white couch wrapped in plastic to protect it from the party, and he was dancing next to a woman in a red dress whose hair was pinned up with a snowflake, and they were doing a silly little routine. She fed him a cookie. He lifted her like a prom photo. People cheered. Sienna turned the camera so we could see the crowd and wrote, "My favorite jolly man," and the song turned and the video ended, and there was another clip of him in the kitchen bumping hips with a man in a green blazer, and another clip of Sienna holding his beard to her face and captioning "We match," and I set my phone on the counter and held the edge because everything tilted, not just the cheating, not just the lie, but the disrespect of the suit, like he had taken my father's work and used it to make himself the center of a joke at a woman's party I was not invited to, and I felt a clean anger line up inside me like a ruler on a desk. I did not throw the phone or call to scream or drive over like a movie because I know myself, and I know that loud does not make me stronger. And I also know that when someone shows you a truth in daylight, they do not get to blame the dark, and I do not give people a chance to rename what I saw. I called the hospital anyway to be sure. The nurse at the desk said yes, the kids had a Santa earlier, a volunteer named Paul who comes every year. A nice man with a white beard who brought real bells, and I said thank you, and I hung up and turned off the porch light and sat at the table and wrote down what I knew, because writing keeps panic from becoming fog. And the facts were simple. Evan borrowed my father's suit under the words hospital. He took it to a private party at Sienna's house. He knew I would see it because we share a town, and the internet is not a locked box. He chose to be seen. He wanted to be seen. Or he is careless enough that the wanting is the same as the doing, and I wrote what I felt. Humiliated, angry, foolish, sad, steady. And I circled steady because it surprised me, but there it was. We have had cracks before this. Little ones at first, a lunch here, a late email there, a photo from an open house where Sienna stood very close and held a sign that said naughty or nice, and Evan captioned, "She's both," and called it marketing. A comment from his mother that I should be grateful he is so social because it helps us. A night when his phone face down on the table caught a reflection in the window, and I recognized the pattern of a heart on the screen that was not mine. A small fight where he said, "I need you to stop acting like a hall monitor," and I said, "I need you to stop acting like rules do not apply to you." And he bought flowers and booked a weekend, and we pushed the feelings under the rug, the way you do when you are busy and tired, and you choose the soft lie rather than the hard truth. And tonight the rug got pulled, and the dust is in my eyes, and I am awake. I am not a person who enjoys revenge for its own sake. I do not like mess for the art of it. I do not like chaos or gossip. I do not like the feeling of getting even and then being left with the same old hole. What I like is fairness and light and a story that matches the facts. What I like is a line you can step over or not and know which side you are on. So as I watched those videos again and my hands stopped shaking, I knew I was not going to do a tantrum. I was going to do a boundary. And because our town loves displays and traditions and pictures and stories that are easy to tell, I knew that the tool I had was the very things they used: the screens, the parties, the chimneys. I walked to the hall closet, and took down the plastic tub I keep labeled Winter Library, and I pulled out a box of red cardstock and a spool of kitchen twine and a pack of sticky labels shaped like stockings, because I buy supplies when they are on sale, and I am prepared to make a bulletin board at any hour. And I set them on the table because my hands need to make something when my mind is deciding. And while I was doing that, my phone buzzed again with a text from Evan, "Running late, kids love me." And I looked at the words and felt nothing. And I opened our family tablet, the one we use for recipes and streaming old movies, and I tapped the Messages app we both forget logs into his account. I did not hack anything. I did not guess a code. The icon is right on the screen like a hand on a door. And I looked at his thread with Sienna, and it was not sweet or clever. It was flirty and braggy and lazy. Pictures of tables and jokes about listing prices, and a photo of a Santa suit on my own couch with the caption, "Can you handle this?" And Sienna's reply, "Bring your list, I have been bad." And I took a screenshot because I am done asking someone to tell me the truth when they have already told it to a stranger. And then I took more, a calendar entry called Slay Night at S's with a winky face. A memo where he had tagged her in a file called Donor Tears for Bright Wishes Party, which is interesting because they use the word party and not gala. And the donor list had names I know from the library plaque on the wall. And next to the top tier, there was an item called Santa Visit Premium and a price. And I read that line twice because I needed it to make sense, which it did in a way that made me feel cold. And I took a screenshot of that too. My job at the library means I read grant reports when we partner with small nonprofits to share space or supplies, and I know how to read a budget, like a story. And I know that a toy drive budget should not have a line for signature cocktails. And I know that a donor party should not be paid for out of the coat fund. And I have eyes, and when you look, you see things, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And there it was, in a shared drive Evan had been added to as a favor. Receipts from a rental company for snow machines and uplighting. Orders for a bar menu with custom ice stamps that said, Bright Wishes Bash, and a list of addresses for a chimney drop, which sounded cute until I realized it was the same date as our neighborhood chimney pocket walk, and the addresses were the same names I have seen on the donor wall and on the PTA committee. I will say this in my plain voice. I do not care how cute your party looks if you bought it with the wrong money. And I do not care how many coats you hand out if you keep the softest one for yourself. And I do not care how fast your laugh is if you use it to jump over a hard question. And I do not care how my husband smiles if he is smiling at someone else while wearing my father's suit. And I do not care if people say this is small town drama, because small towns are where we practice being a bigger kind of person. I took the screenshots with shaking hands and saved them to a folder on the tablet, and also emailed them to myself because I have learned to keep proof in more than one place. And then I opened my own photos and scrolled to last year's hospital visit, to my father's suit under the fluorescent lights, to a little boy with a shaved head clutching the white cuff and grinning while Santa held up a book. And I saved that image too because it felt like an anchor in a storm. I did not text Evan back. I put my phone face down next to the mixing bowl because I needed it to be quiet. I stood at the sink and washed the 3 mugs in the basin because small completions help when big things crack. And I dried them and set them on the shelf and told Juniper to go to bed. And then I sat down and made my plan. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw his clothes on the lawn. I was not going to drag my heart through every friend's kitchen. I was going to tell the truth to the right people in a way they could not pretend not to hear. I was going to deliver it in the language this place speaks. We have chimney pockets on every door in our block. People check them with fresh coffee like it is a holiday mailbox. This town is full of mantles, lined with stockings and cards. People built those mantles to be seen. They like stories by the fire. They like Santa. They like pictures. They like paper you can hold. I would give them their paper. I would put it where they look. I would do it clean. I would sign it with a line that said, "This is the truth," and my initials, because I am not hiding. I would not drop anything at a house with a child who could read and not understand. I would be careful. I would make a list of adults. I would deliver screenshots down the chimneys and let the smoke of denial clear on its own. If this sounds dramatic, it is actually practical. People pretend not to open emails. People say they did not see a post. People throw away anything that looks like a flyer. But if you slide a rolled paper in a felt chimney pocket tied with twine and a cinnamon stick, people put it on their kitchen table and look at it while they eat an orange. And they think about it while they wash a plate. They tell their spouse. They take a picture. They text a neighbor. The ground shifts. And if the paper shows the Santa suit and the donor sheet and the line item for a party that called itself a toy drive, and if the paper is simple and not mean, if it uses facts and not names, except the names that are already public, it is hard to argue with a picture and a price. Before I became a program lead at the library, I thought stories were books on shelves, and then I learned that stories are also budgets and calendars and the way people arrange chairs. And this was going to be a story told in screenshots and chimney pockets and in me not bending for once in a room that expected me to bend. I wrote down the names from the donor list I had seen on the tablet. I crossed out 2 because they were friends who had nothing to do with Sienna's choices. I kept 8. I added 2 houses from our block where I knew they had been at Sienna's party because I saw their shoes in the video, and I know shoes because I put coats and boots away at the coat check for the library fundraiser every fall. I opened a document and pasted the screenshots in order like a simple comic strip. First, the message where Evan asked for the suit with the caption, "Need Santa for Bright." Then the budget page with the line, "Santa Visit Premium." Then the receipt for the ice stamps. Then the gif of Sienna blowing a kiss under the words, "We match." And last, the picture of my father in the hospital with the date. I put a plain text line at the top that said, "This is my husband in my father's suit at a private donor party, the night he told me he was going to the children's hospital." And under that I wrote, "This party was billed to Bright Wishes, which is a charity. These are their own files." And under that I wrote, "If you donated toys or money and thought it was for kids and coats, maybe check where your dollars went." And at the bottom I wrote my name, Hannah, and my number in case someone wanted to ask me anything. And I made a second page that just had the 3 budget items and the donor tier graphic, and a link to the public filing for Bright Wishes, where it said they spent more on events than on disbursements last year. And I kept the tone clean, and I did not use any words that swelled, and I did not add jokes, and I did not add anger. And I hit print, and the paper came out warm and steady and stacked like a plan you can hold. I rolled each set and tied it with twine and slid a cinnamon stick through the knot, because that is what I had and because it made the paper smell like December. And I put 10 of them in a tote bag and set it by the door, and I wrote a sticky note that said "Chimney Walk at 7," and I stuck it under the magnet that holds the picture of my father on the firehouse front steps with his hands in his coat and his grin half caught. And I told him in my head that I was sorry his suit had been in that room and that I was going to handle it. And I felt calm like a door latch when it catches. At 12:31 a.m., the front door opened and Evan walked in with the suit slung over his shoulder and the beard askew and lipstick on the cheek because Sienna had red lipstick. I had seen it in the video, and he stopped when he saw me at the table with the papers and he said, "Oh, hey, I thought you would be asleep." And he tried to make his face small the way he does when he thinks he is disarming me. And I looked at him and said, "Put the suit down and wash your hands before you touch anything else." And he laughed and said, "Okay, boss," and put the suit on the chair and went to the sink. And when he came back, he said, "You will not believe how much the kids loved me." And I said, "Which kids?" And his eyes flicked and he said, "Hannah, do not be like this at midnight." And I said, "I am exactly like this at midnight." And I turned my tablet around and pressed play on the video of him dancing and watched him watch himself. And he said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "That was a donor party. We had to keep them happy." And Sienna asked, and it was good for the drive. And I said, "You used my father's suit for a party, and you lied to me." And he said it was just a party, and I said it was just a lie. And he said, "You know how this town is. You have to show up for people." And I said, "Then you should have shown up for me." And he said, "Do not make this big." And I said, "It is as big as it is." And he said, "Sienna is important for the business." And I said, "Whose business?" And he said, ours. And I said, do not use the word ours while you are wearing lipstick on your face from another woman in my father's suit. And he put his hand to his cheek like he had not noticed, and he wiped it and looked at his fingers like he was the victim of a magic trick. And then he did what he always does. He put his hands out and stepped forward like he could gather the air back in and bring me with it. And I stepped to the side, and he said, I am sorry you saw it this way. And I said, I am sorry you chose it this way. And he said, do not ruin this season. And I said, I am going to tell the truth, and you can decide if that ruins anything. And he said, you are not going to post anything, are you? And I said, I am not a post, I am a person. And I am going to hand paper to people whose names are on those donations, because if I gave money for coats and it paid for ice stamps, I would want someone to tell me. And he said, you will make people mad. And I said, mad is not the worst thing. And I said, you will sleep in the guest room tonight, and we will talk tomorrow about how to return that suit to the hospital in person with a letter. And he said, you are overreacting. And I said, I am setting a line. And I went to bed with Juniper at my feet and the sound of the refrigerator whirring like a slow saw. And I stared at the ceiling and counted 100, and I did not cry. I lay there and thought about matches and paper and chimney pockets and who opens their door first on our block. And at 6 a.m., I got up and made coffee and put the suit on the washing rack to air because it smelled like a bar. And I wiped the beard with a cloth with a little soap and water and felt like I was cleaning my father's name. I went to the library at 8 and put on my cardigan and smiled at the volunteers and ran toddler time like nothing was wrong, because nothing was wrong with the kids, and they deserved their songs. And when my break came, I sat in the office and opened the public filing for Bright Wishes and saw what I expected. A lot of money in, a lot of money out, a lot of money to events and consultants and marketing, and a smaller line to coats and toys. Which is legal if your board signs off, but it is not kind, and it is not what people think when they put $20 in a jar. And I took a picture of the page with the line for events at 40%. And I went back to work and helped a man with a printer and read about reindeer. And then I went home for lunch and saw a text from Sienna to Evan that said, your wife needs a nap. She liked the Santa. And that is when the shame turned into a clean kind of focus I can ride for days. In the days I was growing up, my dad would show me the ladder and say, we do not climb to jump, we climb to fix. And that is what this felt like. Not a jump, but a fix. I am not going to lie and say there was no part of me that wanted to make a bigger noise, to post it all at once and watch the town explode and the comments pile up. But I am 36 and I know the difference between heat and light. And I wanted light. I wanted eyes open. I wanted people to look at the paper in their hands and walk into their own kitchens and ask their own questions. The last Saturday before Christmas is the Chimney Pocket Walk. People will be at their doors. There will be cocoa and cookies and kids clattering about, which is why I decided to wait until later that night when the kids were in bed and the adults were cleaning up and picking wax off tablecloths. And I would walk the block and slide the rolled pages into the pockets of the 10 houses on my list. Which is why I needed the list to be right. I added a house and then took it off and added it back. I called my friend Alma, who has a clear head for money, and asked her to read the budget page and tell me if I was seeing it right. And she said yes. And she said also Martha at the dry cleaners said the Bright Wishes card bounced last week when they picked up their rented suits, which told me more than I wanted to know. And I wrote a new list item, include dry cleaner note, which I did not use because it was hearsay. But I saved it in my head in case someone tried to tell me this was all fine, and I printed 4 more sets in case I needed them. I will say this before anyone else does, I know this will make a mess. I know people will take sides. I know some will say I should have kept it quiet. I know some will say I am jealous. I know some will say that parties are part of fundraising. I know some will say that I am making a mountain out of snow. I know people will talk in the aisles at the grocery store. I live here. I have ears. I also know what it feels like to sit in a hospital ring with a child who has a fever, and to watch a man in a red suit bring a silly book and a soft bear. And I know what it feels like to watch that same suit be used for a wink. And I know what justice looks like on a small scale. It looks like paper where people can see it, and a phone that rings because someone has a question, and a man who comes home from his mother's house and finds his wife at the table with a pen and a small stack of sealed envelopes, and realizes that a certain kind of game is over. I do not know how this is going to land. I do know this: people should not get to hide behind twinkle lights. My plan had 3 parts. Tomorrow morning, I would take the suit to the hospital first, to hand it to the volunteer coordinator and apologize for any confusion, and leave a note with my number. Then I would stop by the thrift store where Bright Wishes had a donation bin and ask if the bin was full this week or if it had been light. Not to catch them in anything, but to hear if real kids would be disappointed. And then at night, I would walk and drop and go home and make tea and sit with Juniper and wait for the calls. Before any of that, I had to make space in my head. So I went outside and swept the porch and dusted the outdoor light and straightened the small stuffed snowman we keep by the door. And my neighbor, Mr. Patel, waved and said, "Lovely weather we are having," when he means cold as bark. And I smiled and said, "Stay warm." And he did not ask me anything because he did not know yet. And that moment of not yet felt like the last quiet minute before a kettle boils, and I knew I would remember it. At 5 that evening, Evan came home in a clean shirt and asked what was for dinner, like regular. And I said, "I am not cooking tonight. There is soup in the pot, and I will be out later." And he said, "Out where?" And I said, "For a walk." And he said, "With who?" And I said, "With myself." And he said, "Hannah, you are not going to do something you regret." And I said, "I regret handing you that suit." And he looked at the floor and said, "Sienna said you might be upset, and I told her you always calm down." And I said, "Do not speak for me again." And he rolled his shoulder like he had a tight muscle and said, "You are making this bigger than it is." And I said, "It is as big as my name and my father's name and a line on a budget." And he sighed and said, "If you do this, people will think you are bitter." And I said, "I can live with people thinking I am bitter better than I can live with being quiet when a truth is in my hand." And then I put on my coat and tucked the rolled papers in my tote and clipped Juniper's leash and said, "I will be back in an hour." And he said, "Hannah," and I shut the door because the conversation was a loop and I had already walked it. The air was cold enough to make your teeth ache. The lights on our street were steady. The chimney pockets hum on doors like red mouths waiting. I could hear a carol from 2 houses over, where the Birches host a sing-along every year. I had a list and a bag and a steady step. I am not a spy, I am not a thief, I am a neighbor with a message. I went to the first house, the big blue one with the wreath that looks like a wheel. And I slid the roll into the felt chimney, and the cinnamon stick made a soft clink on the door. And I went to the next house, the one with the 2 white chairs on the porch, and did the same, and then the next, and my steps began to make a rhythm. And in my head, I could hear my father saying, "Steady hands, steady mind," and I kept them both steady. After I had done 6 houses, I saw a car I recognized roll slowly up the block, and I stepped into the shadow of a maple and watched because habit taught me to look first, and it was Sienna's SUV. I knew it by the bumper sticker that says, "Make it shine." And she pulled into her friend Lydia's driveway and got out with a box that could hold 10 jars of jam or 20 small candles. And she wore a white coat and her hair was wrapped in a red scarf. And she laughed into her phone and walked up Lydia's path. And my hands went cold, not from the weather, but from the thought that my walking had a partner without knowing it. Because she was doing her own chimney walk, dropping donor favor jars or bright wish candles or photo ornaments to say thank you and keep the money warm. And I felt a strange calm because it felt like a fairground. We were both using the same road, the same doors, the same idea of what people look at first, and it made me less afraid and more sure. And I waited until she left, and I walked to Lydia's house and slid my paper in next to whatever Sienna had left. By the time I was done, my toes were numb, and my tote was light, and my breath made soft little clouds, and the street was as quiet as a sleeping dog. I went home and put the kettle on and took off my coat and set my phone on the table and watched nothing happen for 3 minutes, and then everything happened. A text from Alma that said, "Hannah, what did you do?" And I love it. A text from Mr. Birch that said, "We need to talk about donations." A call from a number I did not know that I did not answer. a call from Evan that I did not answer, a voicemail from Lydia's husband that said, I am confused and want to understand, a message from a library volunteer that said, I am proud of you, a text from an old friend that just said, saw it, and then a number I recognized, the volunteer coordinator at St. Ruby's. She said, your father was beloved here, and I would like to talk to you about how we use Santa going forward. And I said, yes. And she said, tomorrow at 9. And I said, I will be there. And she said, bring the suit, and we will hang it together for a minute. And that was the first breath I had taken all day that felt like air. The kettle clicked off. I poured water over a bag and watched it turn brown and clear. And I felt the floor under my feet, and the handle in my hand, and the dog against my leg, and I knew we had left the part of the story where I was still deciding, and we had entered the part where the town and I were both going to be awake, whether we wanted to be or not. And I did not feel like a hero or a villain. I felt like a woman who had found a match and lit a candle so people could see a corner of a room they pretend is bright but is not. And the light was small and right, and I could breathe in it. I carried the suit in a garment bag to St. Ruby's at 8:55 the next morning and stood in the lobby with the coffee smell from the volunteer room and the squeak of a cleaning cart, and felt that slow, tight feeling in my chest loosen when the coordinator came out and hugged me, like I had brought her bread. And she said, your father used to make the nurses laugh until they cried, and he never stayed past his hour, because he said the job was to give joy, not to take rest. And we took the suit into the storage room and unzipped the bag and hung it on the rod, and she touched the sleeve and said we had a call last night from a donor asking if the hospital hired a Santa for a private party, and I said no, we did not. And now I understand why. And I said, I am sorry for the mess, and I will write you a letter for your files. And she said, we will send a note to all staff and volunteers that no outside Santa may use the hospital name without clearance. And she took out a clear bin, and we put the beard on a white towel to air. And she showed me a flyer someone had dropped off from Bright Wishes that said, thanks to our sponsor, St. Ruby's, with our logo in the corner and a snowflake border. And she said, we did not sponsor this. And she looked sad, like paper had lied to her. And I took a photo because that is what I do now, when truth needs a place to live. And I asked her if the kids had enough bears this year, and she said yes, because of Paul. And she smiled and said, you let me know if that suit needs a guardian next year, and we will do it together. And I promised I would, and when I walked out into the cold, I felt like I had put one thing back where it belongs. At the thrift store, the woman behind the counter had a red scarf and chapped knuckles, and she said the bin for Bright Wishes had been full 3 times this month, and then sat empty the last week, and no one came to pick up after Tuesday. And the coats in the back room smelled like dust, because the heat went out in there 2 nights, and it took a day to get someone to fix it. And she said we sent an email to the Bright Wishes contact and did not get a reply. And she sighed and said a coach from the youth center came in yesterday and bought 5 coats from the rack because he could not wait. And I wrote that down because it is a small truth that weighs more than a slogan. When I got home, my phone buzzed in a way that felt like a beehive. A donor I know from the book sale wrote, what is this? And then called and said, tell me everything. And I said, I'm not telling you everything. I sent you the pages. Read them. Ask Bright Wishes about their budget. And he said, I will, and hung up. And another text said, thank you for saying what we all know. And another said, who do you think you are? And another from a blocked number said, take it down or we will sue. And I put the phone face down and set a timer to check it every hour so I would not drown in a stream with no end. Evan came into the kitchen with a tight jaw and said, you are going to destroy a charity because you are mad at me. And I said, a charity destroys itself when it uses kids to sell a party. And he said, you do not know how these things work. And I said, I know how to read a budget. And he said, this is ugly. And I said, it was ugly when you lied. And he said, if you ruin this, you will make enemies we cannot afford. And I said, stop saying we for things you did without me. And he put his hand on the counter and leaned in like he could tip me back, and I looked at his hand and he moved it. At 10, my director at the library, Ms. Costa, called and said we have had 5 calls from donors and 2 from council members and 1 from a board member asking if the library is taking a stance against Bright Wishes because our program lead is their competitor, And I said, I am not a competitor, I am a citizen at home on my own time. And she said, I know, but we are a public thing and we must look like we are fair to all. And she said, we will need you off the front desk for a week so the news dies down. And she said, you can log hours sorting donations in the back, but please do no public posts. And my throat went dry because the front desk is where I feel useful, and the rest of the day was story time and wintercraft, and I had planned a snowflake chain with the toddlers, and now I would not get to see them hold the paper rings like necklaces. And I sat down on the step stool in the pantry and said, I understand, and I will follow the policy. And when I hung up, I cried into a dish towel for a minute because the weight came all at once. And then I wiped my face and put the towel in the wash because salt can stain. At noon, a courier brought a letter from a law office that represents Bright Wishes. It said my Chimney papers were defamatory and asked me to cease all communication with their donors. It said my screenshots were stolen property and that I had made false claims that harmed their brand. It said they would seek damages if I did not stop, and the letter had a lot of words with teeth. And I took a picture and sent it to Alma, and she wrote back, take a breath, and then sent me the email of a clinic that does free consultations for speech issues, and I filled out the form and wrote simple sentences. I shared screenshots from a drive to my shared household tablet. They were not behind a code, they were my husband's, and on our shared device. I rolled copies and placed them in neighbors' chimney pockets. I included public filing pages. My statements were my opinion based on those facts, and a person wrote back within 2 hours and said truth is a defense, and public files are public, and delivery to mailboxes has rules, but you use door hangers, and you are within your rights to speak. And that felt like a steady arm on my back. At 2, Sienna posted a story with her face angled and her voice soft, saying rumors are so sad in a season of light, and she loved when people give from their hearts. She said a dear friend dressed as Santa at a private home to thank donors, and that event was fully underwritten by a sponsor, and not one coat or toy was compromised. She showed a check with a blurred name and a dollar amount, and laughed and blew a kiss. She said our haters will always exist, but our work goes on. And then she posted a photo of a child with a coat, with the face covered and a caption that said, we do it for them. And my hands shook with anger, not because she defended herself. She has a right to say what she thinks, but because she used a child like paper on a clipboard, and I wanted to go for a run until my lungs burned, but I am not a runner. So I swept the kitchen and cleaned the stove until the lines shone, and then I called the thrift store again, and the woman said someone came by 2 hours after you left and picked up the coats, and did not leave a receipt and drove off, and she sounded tired like the afternoon had pressed on her shoulders. Around 3, I checked the tablet again, and the shared drive icon was gone, and the folder asked for a code. And I stared at the screen and felt that small drop like when an elevator moves too quick. And I thought of the screenshots I had already saved and felt grateful for my habit of copying. And then a new text came in from a number I did not know that said, I work at Bright Wishes, and I cannot watch this anymore. Can we talk somewhere safe? And my fingers went cold, and I texted back, who are you? And she wrote, my name is Mara, and I am the program assistant. And I sat very still and asked where, and she wrote, the bench under the old firehouse bell at 5. And I said yes, and put on my shoes and walked Juniper around the block to get the nerves out. And I could feel eyes on me from behind blinds in 2 houses, and I made myself hold my head straight because I did not do anything wrong. I held up paper. At 5, the cold had a bite, and the bell at the firehouse looked like a brown moon, and I sat on the bench with my hands in my pockets, and Mara walked up with a careful step. She was young, maybe 23, with a navy coat and hair that kept falling in her face, and she said, I saw your papers, and I cried in the bathroom, because I have been trying to tell myself that the part we do for kids is enough, but I cannot keep quiet. And she handed me a flat envelope and said there are 2 budgets, the public one and the internal one. They move costs between them when they need to. They call things donor stewardship, but it is really parties and gifts. We ran a program called Chimney to deliver favor jars and photos to top donors, and it was paid for out of the general fund. And the Santa line is on both sheets because they could not make the numbers match last year. And she looked at the ground and said she told us to shred old planning docs yesterday. And I said, thank you. And she kept talking like a river goes when it finds a slope. She said Sienna plans to announce a new board slate at the gala on Friday, and your husband is on it as a community liaison to grow the Santa program and a pop-up at open houses. She said they want to brand Santa and sell packages to corporate donors, where the Santa visits offices and the money goes to Bright Wishes, but the event costs are high, and I felt a small dizzy roll like I was on a boat, not because of my husband's name on a list. I am past surprise on that, but because of how far the drift had gone, and I opened the envelope and saw printed emails with dates and headers. I saw a sheet called Board Slate Proposed with Evan Care in the third slot. I saw a memo about ice stamps under marketing props. I saw the line items for rental heaters and a DJ. I saw a Google sheet titled Chimney Drop with the same addresses as my list. I saw a note that said Invoice to General Programming to avoid capacity cap. I saw a picture from the party with Sienna and Evan by the tree, and my father's suit in the corner of the frame, folded over a chair like a throw. And my throat closed, and I wanted to sit down on the ground and let the cold do the thinking. In that moment, a car pulled up and stopped too fast, and Evan got out and walked toward us with his hands open like, please calm down. And he said, Hannah, you cannot talk to staff. This is a witch hunt. And Mara flinched and tucked her hair behind her ear and took 2 steps back. And he said, you cannot take proprietary documents. And Mara said, I took my own emails. And he looked at me and said, put that envelope down. And I could see the line in his jaw go hard. And I said, no. And he reached toward the envelope, and I pulled it back, and he grabbed for it anyway. And his fingers caught the corner, and the papers slid. And half of them fell to the ground, and the wind took 2 and pushed them into a puddle by the curb. And I felt that useless flash of wanting to dig in water for something that is already wet. And I crouched and picked up what I could, and Mara said, I have digital copies, and sent them to the email on your paper. And then she moved around us and walked away fast. And Evan said, think about what you are doing. And I said, I am. And he said, you will blow up my job and your own. And I said, my job is not a costume. And he said, you could have just told me you were hurt. You did not have to make a show. And I said, the show happened in public. And he laughed once like there was a pebble in his mouth, and got back in the car and drove off. And I sat on the bench with wet paper and a heart that felt too heavy. And I cried in a small way that made no sound, because I did not want anyone walking by to look at me and think drowning. When I got home, the porch light was on, and there was a note taped to the door that said, stop or you will be sorry, in block letters cut from a printout. And there was also a small bag of chocolate bark from Alma with a note that said, eat sweet stuff when bitter knocks. And I held both and felt the tug of 2 engines in my own chest. And I went inside and locked the door and checked that the windows were latched, and gave Juniper her dinner, and then I sat at the table and opened my email and saw a new folder with files from Mara, and I clicked, and they opened, and the air moved back into my lungs because I had the proof of what my eyes knew, and I saved the files to a drive that is not shared with anyone. And I printed 2 things and put them in my folder, and put the whole thing in the oven, which is not on at 9 at night, because I had a fear that if Evan came back, he would go straight to the desk. And I am a person who hides things in the oven like I live in a small apartment in a story. And I smiled at myself for the first time that day. At 10 Nis, Costa texted me to say the board chair of Bright Wishes had called the mayor, who called her to ask if the library partner table at the gala would still be there. And she said, do not answer and get some sleep. And I told her I would not be at the gala. And I put my phone face down and then face up, and then face down. And I finally turned it off because I could not hold the voices of the whole town in my hand, and also my own breath. At 11, Evan's mother left me a voicemail that said she did not raise her son to be humiliated by a woman who cannot keep her home out of the public eye. She said nice families handle trouble in private, and she said if I did not stop, she would make sure the library had no sponsors next year. And I saved the voicemail in a folder labeled Keep. And then I threw 3 ice cubes into the sink and listened to them crack, because it made me feel like I could control something. The next morning, I woke up with a pain behind my eyes, and the house felt like a stage after someone forgot to put away the props. The chimney pockets on the block were full of thank you notes, and I knew some of those thanks were not for me. They were for Sienna's jars or for a neighbor's sugar cookies, and that was fine. I did not do this for thanks. I did it for the kind of sunlight that can make dust show so you can wipe it. And I made coffee and put butter on toast and looked at the dog and told her we would take a long walk because her head was tilted, like she thought the house was thinking too loud. And then my phone buzzed with a message from the newspaper, the Cedar Ridge Ledger. A reporter named Tom, who has covered the school board and wrote mild, sad pieces about road work. And he said, "I have seen a copy of your chimney paper, and I have heard from 2 donors and 1 staffer." And he asked if I would talk on the record, and my heart did that thing a bird does when it hits a clean window and realizes it is glass. And I wrote back, "I will talk with documents." And he wrote, "Send what you have, and I will ask the charity for a response." And I thought that was fair, and I sent the 2 budget sheets, and the board slate page, and the invoices for the heaters, and the bar, and the ice stamps. And he wrote back, "Thank you, please sit tight." And I laughed once at the phrase, "sit tight," because my body had been tight for 3 days, and I needed to move. So I put on my hat and took Juniper out into the cold, and we walked toward the firehouse, and then past it and around the lake, where kids throw pebbles in spring, and it is ice now. And I thought about my father, sanding the wooden crossbars on the ladder with paper in slow strokes, and saying, "You do not rush the thing that keeps you alive." When we came back, there were 3 messages that pulled in different directions. One from Mara that said she had been called into a meeting and she would let me know after if her job still existed. One from Tom that said Bright Wishes sent a statement that the party was underwritten by a sponsor, and every dollar donated to the program went to kids. And one from Miss Costa that said the city attorney advises me to put you on leave until after the holiday to protect the library from claims it is endorsing activity. And that email had the shape of a trap, but also the tone of someone trying to hold a line under many hands. And I felt my face heat and then go cold, because work is where I stand up the most, and now I would sit down. And I wrote back, "I understand, and please tell the subs the craft plan lives in the top drawer and the hot glue is on the 3rd shelf, and the paper cutter slips unless you hold the front edge down." And she wrote back, a heart. At noon, the Ledger posted an article online that said donors question holiday charity expenses and used gentle words and heavy facts. It quoted the public filings, and it quoted me saying I delivered papers to neighbors because they deserved to ask questions. And it quoted Bright Wishes saying the party was paid by a sponsor. And it said the hospital denied sponsoring any outside event. And it said the thrift store confirmed a pickup gap. And the comments under the article split like a log. Some said, "Thank you for asking this." Some said, "This is a hit job by a bitter wife." Some said, "It is normal to have parties to raise money." Some said, "I care where my money goes." And the sound that rose up felt like a pot rolling, and I sat at the table and let it cook, because I cannot stir every pot. At 2 there was a knock, and I looked through the peephole by habit, and it was Sienna with a gift bag and a smile that did not reach her eyes. And I opened the door and stood in it, and she said, "Can we talk woman to woman?" And I said, "We can talk on the porch." And she said, "I brought peppermint bark and an apology if our party hurt your feelings." And I said, "My feelings are not the headline." And she said, "You made them the headline." And I said, "I put facts on paper." And she said, "You do not understand how hard it is to keep donors engaged." And I said, "I do. I run a library." And she laughed and said, "Those are not the same." And I said, "They are exactly the same in the way that matters. People give because they trust." And she said, "Stop before you make this worse." And I said, "It is already worse that you used my father's suit and my husband and my town for a photo set." And her smile dropped, and she said, "The board will handle this, and your job cannot protect you." And I said, "I am not hiding behind my job." And she said, "Then I guess I will see you in print." And she put the bag on the porch step and walked away. And the bag had a tag that said neighbors and was probably meant for the house next door. And I left it there because it was not mine to touch. The worst moment came that night when I checked my email and saw a message from the hospital that said, because of the news, they would pause all outside Santa visits for the season and review with risk management. And while I knew it was the right call in a world full of cameras and labels, I put my head in my hands at the thought of a child waiting for the bells and hearing only the beep of a machine. And I almost wrote back and offered to come in with the suit and sit by the bed without it. And then I remembered my father's line about the job being to give joy, not to take rest, and I did not push. And I went into the bedroom and took the cedar box down and opened it, and took out the little pouch where he kept the spare buttons for the suit. And I held one in my palm like a coin, and I let myself cry, not big, not loud, more like a slow rain you only notice because the window goes soft. And I said out loud, "I miss you." And I also said, "I am doing my best." And it felt like he was in the doorway with his hand on the jamb, nodding. I slept like I was waiting for the smoke alarm, light and ready to jump. And in the morning, Evan called to say he was moving in with his mother for a while to let things cool off. And he said if I did not retract my statements and apologize in a post, he would file a suit for defamation, and also for an injunction to stop me from using his business files. And I said, "You can file what you need." And he said, "And the dog will come with me half the time." And I said, "No." And he said, "You do not get to decide alone." And I said, "Her vet records are in my name, and we can talk to a mediator." And he said, "You are being cruel." And I said, "I am being clear." And he said, "I loved seeing you mad once. It was hot. And now it is old." And I hung up because the conversation had gone into a ditch that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with trying to press buttons. And I am too busy to be someone's switch. The day crawled. The Ledger posted a follow-up that said the Attorney General's office had received calls and would review the filing because that is their job. And that made my stomach settle a little because it meant there is a process larger than our street. But then Miss Costa forwarded me an email from a council aide asking if the library would reconsider its joint coat drive with Bright Wishes next year. And I wrote back politely that we will review. And my finger hovered a half second over send because I wanted to add a sentence about trust being a resource you cannot borrow. And I did not, because plain answers serve better than small cuts. That evening, I walked to the firehouse again, and the bench was empty and the bell was still. And I sat and watched my breath, and my phone buzzed with a message from Mara that said they told me to leave early and come back after the holiday, which is a soft way to say suspended. And I told her I was sorry and that I would name her if she wanted me to in the ledger. And she said, "Not yet. I want to keep my health insurance." And I said, "Okay, I will keep you safe." And then she wrote, "I loaded a timed email to you with the rest in case they shut down my account." And I felt that small warmth that comes when someone younger is braver than you expected, and you remember that this town belongs to the next person too. I went home to a quiet house and a note on the kitchen island in Evan's handwriting that said, "Can we be adults and fix this?" And attached was a typed apology he wanted me to post that said I overreacted and misunderstood, and that Bright Wishes had my full support, and that the Santa suit had been handled with respect, and that I was sorry for any confusion. And I held the paper until my hand hurt. And then I tore it in half and in half again, and put it in the compost bin. Because even paper with bad sentences can become soil later if you let it. And I stood there for a long time with my hands on the counter. And I said out loud the part I had not said yet, which is that I knew this might cost me my job if the board and the politics got worse, and I had to decide if I would still do it. And the answer was yes, because I am not built to hold a quiet that rots. I am built to set things in order, even if I have to stand in a storm while I do it. And this is the storm. I ended that long, low day by making a list called If I Lose, and it had 6 items. My father still loved me, and I still love him. The suit lives with me, not with lies. The hospital knows what happened and will guard their name. The ledger printed facts. The donors will ask questions even if they defend first. And Juniper will still need breakfast. And then I made a second list called If I Win, and it had 3 items. The charity will become what it says it is, or it will stop. The suit will be used for kids and not for cameras. And I will get my own life back cleaner than it was. And I put both lists under a magnet on the fridge and took a picture in case anything burned. And then I went to bed with my socks on because the air in my house had a chill I could not chase out. And I closed my eyes and saw the bell and the bench and the roll of paper in a red felt pocket and a door opening. And I thought tomorrow I go to the gala without a ticket. I woke up on the day of the gala and ironed a plain black dress because simple is my armor, and I put my hair in a low bun because flyaways make me feel like my head is busy, and I printed a fresh set of pages with the new files Mara sent, and I added a short note at the top that said, "This is what I saw, and this is what I saved, and if you gave money, please ask for a ledger, not a photo." And I put them in a flat envelope and then in a tote under a scarf. And I fed Juniper and walked her in the cold and told her I would be back soon because dogs understand a promise better than most people. And when I came in, my phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Birch. He wrote, "I have 2 tickets because my sister has the flu and my wife is staying home. And if you want the second, you can sit at our table and just watch." And I stood in my kitchen and thanked a quiet sky and wrote back, "Yes, please." And he texted the QR code. And I printed it because paper calms me, and I tucked it in my coat and set my hands on the counter to still them. And at 4, Tom from the Ledger texted that he had a press badge and would be in the back, and that he had heard the charity plan to present a board slate and a program called Santa at Work, where they sell office visits. And I wrote back, "I saw that too." And he wrote, "Are you going to disrupt?" And I said, "I am going to witness, and I am going to deliver paper." And he wrote, "Copy that." And I smiled at the word copy because it made me think of the old library printer that jams when it is tired, and how you just open the side and smooth the page and it goes again. I got to the venue at 6 with the first rush. The ballroom at the Belfield Hotel has 2 fake fireplaces with carved mantels and electric flames, and they had put red felt chimney pockets on the chair backs as decor, and the centerpieces were white boxes with cutout chimneys and battery candles that flickered, and you could smell pine from the wreaths and sugar from the dessert table and a little bit of hairspray. And the check-in line moved fast, like a card trick, and people hugged each other and said how nice everything looked. And I stood with Mr. Birch and his wife's sister, whom I know from the book sale, and they were kind and did not ask me anything until we were through the doors. And then he leaned in and said, "We will sit by the wall," and I nodded. And as we found the table, I saw Evan across the room, not in the suit, in a blue jacket with a white shirt and no tie because he likes to look easy. And he saw me, and his eyes did that small narrowing thing that says I am calculating, and he started toward me, and I lifted my hand a fraction and shook my head once. And he stopped and turned toward a man in a plaid jacket, like he had been headed there all along. And Sienna stood near the stage in a silver dress that caught the light and made her look like a decoration, and she smiled at people as if each hello added a bit of shine. And when she looked toward our table, her smile did not change, but I could feel the ice under it, like a pond in January. The room filled and buzzed. The band played soft songs. The silent auction tables had baskets with wine and tickets and a spa day. The chimneys on the tables looked cute from the door and complicated up close, because they had little slots in the top, like mail slots. And I thought about how people love putting things in slots, and pulling them out, and feeling like something came to them. And I knew the timing I wanted, not at the start, when people were only looking at each other, not in the middle, when the speeches began, but during dessert when fingers are sticky and eyes wander. And I kept my tote on the chair back and my heart slow, and I drank water and ate 2 bites of a roll and waited. The program started at 7:30. The lights dimmed. Sienna took the mic with the ease of a person who practices in mirrors and said, "Thank you," with a long, soft vowel, and called it a season of light. She told a story about a girl who found mittens in a chimney pocket and said, "You put those there." And people hummed at the right places because they like to be told they are kind. And she showed a slideshow of coats on hangers and toys in boxes and volunteers with red hats. And then a picture from the donor party flashed by. A wide shot of a tree and a crowd and a blur of red in the corner. And my skin went cold because I saw the sleeve of my father's suit peeking from a chair in the bottom right. And she said, "A generous sponsor underwrote our donor appreciation night so that we could thank our partners without touching program dollars." She thanked a name that sounded like a boutique staging company from across the county, and a man at the next table muttered, "I know them and they do not have that kind of money." And the whisper moved like a draft, and I did not move. I let the draft pass. After the applause for the video, the board chair, a man with a soft voice and a large watch, came up and said, "We will vote on our board slate by acclaim at the end." And he read names including Evans, and my face stayed still, and my chest decided to beat in my ears. And he said, "We will also unveil a new initiative called Santa at Work, where office teams can book a Santa visit with proceeds to our coat fund." And there was a cheer from the side of the room where the realtors and mortgage folks sit. And I felt like someone had put a soda in my stomach and shook it. And I still did not move because the plan was dessert. It came. Small plates of almond cake and tarts and some kind of chocolate cup that cracked when you bit it. And the band played louder to keep the mood up. And the table talk rose, and I took a breath and slid my tote strap up and stood like I was going to the restroom. And I walked to the back corner by the coat check and took the flat envelope out and pulled the scrolls with the twine and the cinnamon sticks and put them under my arm. And I walked table to table like any volunteer with a job, and I slipped one rolled paper into the chimney centerpiece at each table on my list. Not all the tables, just the ones with the names I had seen on the donor tier sheet, and 2 by the stage where the board sat. And no one stopped me because I looked like I belonged, because I was not snaking, because a person who walks with a list does not make people nervous. And I finished and put my empty envelope in my tote and sat, and my hands shook a little, so I put them under the table on my knees and pressed down like a brake. And after 2 minutes, a woman at the table by the wall pulled a roll from her chimney and laughed and said, "There is something in here." And she untied the string and rolled it flat, and the cinnamon stick fell. And she set it by her plate, and her face changed. Not big, just a lift of the chin and a stilling of the eyes. And she passed it to the man next to her, and he read and looked toward the stage. And at another table, a man took a roll from his chimney and did not read. He handed it to his wife like it was a menu and then looked at his phone. And she read and put her hand on the table and did not move it. And in a minute, the whisper turned into a murmur. And people began to stand and lean toward each other and point, not at me. At the papers, at the screen where the slideshow still looped coats and bells, and the band shifted into a louder song as if they could drown the sound of paper. And Sienna smiled wider and told the drummer to give her a beat. And then the board chair tapped the mic and said, "Please take your seats." And the room did not all at once. And he said again, "Please take your seats, and we will clear up any confusion." And that word confusion hung in the air like a balloon that lost its string. A donor at the front stood and said, "Who underwrote the party?" And the board chair said, "A sponsor." And the donor said, "Which sponsor? Name, please." And the chair said, "We will list all sponsors on our site." And the donor said, "We are not on the site. We are here." And a woman at my table, a teacher I know from story time, raised her voice and said, "How much of my check goes to chimneys like these and not to coats?" And someone by the fireplace said, "What is Santa at work, if not what we saw in that slideshow? And what part is for kids?" And the sound changed, not a shout, a steady asking. And Sienna held the mic and said, "This is not how we celebrate." And a hand shot up, and Mr. Birch did something I did not expect. He said into the room, "I built a wing on the library. It is on the wall, and when they ask me for money, they show me a budget and they spend it as promised. And that is all anyone is asking." And the room clapped. Not everyone, enough to hear. And I sat still and watched the board chair wipe his forehead with his napkin like it was hot in there, and not cold truth making him sweat. And he said, "We will pause the vote on the board slate for this evening, and we will publish our full event budget next week." And from the back, Tom put his hand up and said, "Can I have a copy of the budget you used to book the snow machines and the heaters and the bar?" And the chair said, "Please see staff." And staff looked at each other. And the Santa at Work slide clicked to a blank screen because someone back there pressed the wrong button, and the band started a song too fast and stopped. And Sienna said into her mic, "We are blessed and we give." And that sentence bounced back to her like a ball without air. I stood and left while the room tried to decide if it was a party or a meeting. I walked down the hall past the framed photos of brides and holiday trees. And a woman in a headset followed me and said, "You cannot hand out materials." And I said I handed them to chimneys. and walked out into the lobby where the staff had laid out stacks of program cards. And I took one and wrote my number on it and left it by the coat check and told the attendant, if anyone wants to reach me, I will answer. And she nodded because she had been watching with her own eyes and she knew which way the wind was going. And I stepped outside into the cold, and the porter opened the door and said good night. And I said good night, and he gave me a small nod, like a person who had seen most things and still showed up to hold the door. And I walked down the steps with my coat open because the air felt like medicine. I did not wait for explosion or speeches. I did not like to watch things break if I do not need to hold them. I walked to my car and drove home and fed the dog and sat at the table with a glass of water and my phone face down because I did not want to see it light like a slot machine. And I listened to the house, the hum of the heater and the tick of the kitchen clock, and a small sound in the vent that might be a leaf. And then I turned the phone over and saw texts, a line of them, from numbers I knew and did not know. Thank you. What now? My check will be stopped. Are you safe? You are cruel. How dare you? Where did you get those files? You are brave. You ruined a good night. And I scrolled and my thumb shook, and I put the phone down and made tea, and stood at the back door and looked at the porch light and told myself I did what I came to do. At midnight, Tom texted a link. The Ledger had posted a second piece that said Gala Night paused after donors received budget prints and used my phrase, and that made me smile a little because words moving from my hand to print made me feel less alone. And the piece said the Attorney General's office had opened an inquiry and asked any staff with documents to send them to a tip line, and I read that twice because it was real, not a rumor, a number you could call. And I sent Mara the link and wrote, I will stand next to you if you decide to send more, and she wrote back with a heart and a tiny bell emoji, like she wanted me to know she understood the suit mattered. And next morning, the board chair of Bright Wishes resigned. The site went down for maintenance, and Sienna posted a video saying, we are victims of a smear, and she loved the children, and she loved this town, and she would not let hate win. And then she posted a picture of a coffee cup with latte art, because that is what she does when she is nervous. She posts pictures as if the shape of foam can make a point. And I turned my phone off again and took Juniper for a long walk where the path by the lake crunches and you can hear it in your knees. And when I came back, there was a paper on my porch under the mat, so it would not blow. It was a letter from the board of the library saying they had voted to place me on paid leave for the rest of the week so the town could breathe, and it felt like a hand on my shoulder and also like a shelf being emptied. And I put the letter on the fridge under a magnet and went to the cedar box and checked the suit one more time and folded the beard in tissue and closed the lid and set it back in the closet and leaned on the door and breathed like I was standing at the top of a ladder. In the afternoon, the hospital called again and said they would not cancel Santa, but they would change how they do it. No outside photo tags. No outside donors using the name without a written agreement. All visits in the books. All suits clean. And the volunteer coordinator asked if I could help draft the guidelines, because she said, you have a careful way. And I said yes, and the yes made me feel like a person who still has a place in the room where kids sit. And I opened my laptop and wrote sentences like a person putting up rails on a deck, clear and quiet and not so high that no one can see over. And when I was done, I sent them, and I put my hand on the table, and I felt like wood is stronger when it is held. That evening, Evan showed up at the house with his mother and a man in a suit who worked with his broker friend, and they stood on my porch, and he said, we need to talk. And I said, we will talk in the morning at the mediator's office if you want. And he said, now. And his mother said, this neighborhood belongs to us, which has never been true. And I said, I will speak in plain words, and then I am going to shut the door. I said, I will not retract. I will not post your apology. I will not attend your meetings. I will not give you the dog. I will not be quiet about budgets or suits. I will be civil in every exchange. I will divide property with a list. I will show up to sign what needs to be signed. I will not stand in your way if you choose to find a new way to live. I will not answer your mother's calls. I will not stand on this porch to be scolded. And she opened her mouth as if to say a sharp thing, and I held up my hand, and she stopped, and her face went flat. And the man in the suit said, we could avoid courts if I apologized. And I said, you can avoid courts by using honest budgets. And Evan said, "Hannah, please." And I said, "Evan, please, please hear me. I am done letting please mean compromise when I am the only one giving." And he looked hurt in a small way, like I had taken away his favorite jacket, and I shut the door. 2 days later, the Ledger ran a front page that said State opens formal investigation into Bright Wishes. And below that, a photo of the Chimney centerpiece with my scroll and a caption that said, "Anonymous papers given to donors." And I rolled my eyes at anonymous, but I did not call to correct it, because the point is not my name. It is the light. And in the text, they quoted 3 donors on the record asking for a plan to rebuild the charity with real controls, and they quoted the hospital. And they quoted me saying, "My father taught me that the job is to bring joy and leave the room in order." And after I read it, I put the paper on the table and placed a mug on it like a paperweight, and I stood at the sink and laughed, one short breath, because my words had become a thing with ink, and it made the kitchen feel less like a battlefield. The phone calls slowed, the comments on the article turned to arguing about a different thing, which is what the internet does when it gets bored. And the people who mattered started to move in real ways. A donor set up a small emergency coat fund at the community foundation for the rest of the winter, and asked me if I would serve on a tiny committee to approve invoices. And I said yes, if we publish everything on a simple sheet, and he said yes. And the thrift store called to say the bin had been picked up on schedule by a different person who left a receipt and wrote thank you on it. And the youth center coach sent a photo of boys in new coats with faces we do not post, just hands and sleeves. And the photo made me put my hand flat on the table and close my eyes and breathe. Mara texted to say she was working with a state investigator to hand over files and that she could not go back to the office, even to get her mug, because the locks were changed. And I told her I could buy her a new mug and put her name on it in permanent marker and leave it at the library for the day she gets a better job. And she wrote a smile emoji and said, "Do a star too." And I sent a photo of a mug with a star drawn with a shaky hand because permanent marker bleeds if you push, and she wrote, "Perfect." In the new year, the board of Bright Wishes dissolved and a temporary manager was appointed by the court. A woman with a tired eyes and a straight back whose job is to close things that are not working and fold them into things that are. And she called me and all the donors and the hospital and the thrift store, and we sat at a folding table in a community room that smells like lemon cleaner, and made a simple plan to get the last coats out and to cancel Santa at work, because we all agreed that work is work, and Santa is not a brand. And she said later, there will be a new nonprofit with a better board, or maybe the old one with a clean slate, and people who are willing to show their ledgers like they show their centerpieces. And I said good, and I went home and took down my list called If I Lose, and set it next to my list called If I Win, and saw that most of the items matched, because the truth is the same on either road if you keep your feet on it. As for Evan, we met with a mediator in an office with soft chairs. We made a chart of our accounts. We divided the house and the things. He kept the fancy blender he never used, and I kept the cedar box and the mugs and the chair by the window and the dog, because he saw the vet records and said, fine, and because sometimes the part that looks like mercy is just a person picking the thing that makes them look least bad. And I signed papers with a steady hand, and he signed with a stiff one. And when we left, we stood on the sidewalk, and it was cold. And he said, "I did love you." And I said, "I did not ask you to stop." And he said, "I will change." And I said, "Am not a door back to what you had." And he said, "I miss Juniper." And I said, "You can text to walk her at the park, but do not come to the house." And he said, "Okay," and put his hands in his pockets and looked smaller than I have ever seen him. And I felt a clean grief, not for the man he is, for the life I worked hard to hold. And I went home and made soup and gave Juniper a piece of carrot because she thinks carrots are treats. In February, the Attorney General announced a settlement. Bright Wishes would be wound down and the remaining funds sent to a trust for coats and books run through the community foundation. And there would be an audit, and Sienna would agree not to serve as an officer of a charity for 3 years and to complete a training on nonprofit law. And Evan would not join the board because there would be no board. and the article in the Ledger used words like consent and oversight, and it felt like the slow, boring work of repair, which is the only kind that lasts. And at the end of the piece, Tom wrote a sentence that made me put my hand on my heart. He wrote, "We are a small town and we know how to do big things quietly." And I cut that out and put it on the fridge. Spring came. The snow slid off the roof. The chimney pockets got packed away in bins in the PTA shed. The maple buds pushed green. And I went back to the front desk at the library and ran toddler time and trained a new volunteer on the copier and spoke to a woman in a soft voice about how to apply for a job on the public computer. And my body remembered how to stand at the service desk and lean forward without making my back sore. And Miss Costa handed me a note from the board saying, "Thank you for your grace during a hard month." And I put it in the drawer with the paper clips, because praise is nice and paper clips hold more. In December, almost a year from the night of the party, I walked into St. Ruby's in the suit because the hospital had asked me to stand in for the Monday shift since Paul had the flu. And I had said yes because this is what I always wanted for the suit. And I put the beard on and the hat, and I sat by a bed and read a book about a dog who finds his way home, and a girl with a small voice said, "I like your bells." And I moved my wrist and made them ring. And in the hall, the volunteer coordinator leaned against the wall and smiled and did not take pictures. And after the hour was up, I took off the suit and folded it on the towel and put it in the bag and washed my hands and left a note for the next day that said the right cuff is a little loose, and I added a spare button in the inside pocket, and there is a needle with red thread in the bag. And I took the elevator down and walked out into the cold, and the sky was that pale blue that comes at the edge of winter. And when I got home, there was a small roll of paper in my own chimney pocket, even though it was early in the season, and the pockets were not up yet. And I took it out and untied the twine, and it was a single screenshot printed in black and white. It was a text from months ago from Sienna to a man whose number I did not know. It said we could put one more item under donor stewardship if we need to, and under it someone had written in pencil, "No more," and there was no name. And I set the paper on the table and looked at the pencil words and felt a small bright thing in my chest. Not joy, not victory, just the knowledge that people can learn, even if they started wrong. And I rolled the paper back up and put it in the cedar box with the spare buttons, and I shut the lid and made tea. The last surprise came the night of the chimney walk. We had tied the red felt pockets to the knobs, and the kids ran door to door with mittens on. And I dropped peppermint sticks and notes that said, "See you at the winter story hour." And when we came home, the pocket on our door held two things, a folded card and a small brass bell on a red string. And the card had a photo of the hospital hallway with a caption that said, "In memory of a man who made us laugh. Thank you for guarding his suit." And the bell had 3 letters scratched on it by hand, JEK, my father's initials. And I held the bell and it was warm from someone's palm. And I closed my hand around it, and the sound it made was not loud, but it went through the house like it knew the corners. And I realized the twist of this whole story is not the party or the paper or the headlines. The twist is that my father's work was still being done by people whose names I do not know, that a suit can be a tool and so can a screenshot, that a chimney pocket can carry more than candy. It can carry a town waking up. Evan sent a card at New Year. He wrote, "I hope you are well, and I am trying to be better." And I sent back a note that said, "I hope you keep your promises to yourself." And that is the only language we share now. Simple and present and not heavy with what-ifs. And I kept walking the dog and printing programs and showing up and putting things in the right bins and saying my name in rooms where people asked for it and not saying it where they did not. And sometimes I passed the Belfield Hotel and I could still see the night in the window, the fake flames, the chimneys, the faces turning. And I did not feel triumph. I felt relief, like a fire put out before it found the roof. A room that went dark and then bright again because someone found the switch. People still joke with me. They call me Santa's auditor. They leave me cookies in my chimney pocket with notes that say, "For the brave librarian." And I smile and say thank you and eat one cookie and take the rest to the staff room because praise is best when shared. And when the weather turns and the coats come out, I double-check the tag on mine to make sure it still says what I think it says. And I check the hooks by the door, and I check the mail slot. And I check the chimney pocket. And when I find a slip of paper that says "Thank you for the light," I tuck it in the cedar box next to the bell and the spare buttons, because it belongs there, with the things that were used for the right reasons and came home clean.